Chapter 8. Like most stretches of undisturbed freedom, Rue's came to a sudden and unpleasant end. It happened the following day, while she was sitting in her cave watching a curious bundle of sticks moving across the water in the distance. It had a herky-jerky sort of propulsion that captured her attention. She watched it, squinting, trying to figure out how it could push against the current like that. At the sound of a boat motor starting up, the bundle of sticks swerved abruptly, and beneath the sticks a large brown eye gazed in Rue's direction. Rue blew out a breath of surprise and delight. Now she could see the stag's rolling shoulders as it swam past Cough Rock, zigzagging with alarm. The motor sounded like it was coming from the lagoon. Rue poked her head out and craned her neck around the edge of the cave. There was Miss Valentine, guiding her Boston whaler beneath the stone arch and out into the river. That struck Rue as odd. It was too early for her to be collecting the mail. And anyways, she was going in the opposite direction of Chokecherry Island. Rue watched the boat curl around Cough Rock and disappear from her line of sight. Abandoning her cave, Rue hurried across the lawn, which the sun had recently coaxed from its dull brown into a bright green. When she reached the semicircular patio, she perched on top of the low stone wall that hedged in the patio on one side, and she tracked the whaler as it plowed across the river towards Clayton. Maybe my uncle's coming back, she thought. She felt a rush of nervous anticipation. She wondered if he'd be happy to see that she was dressed in the clothes he had bought for her, a pair of jeans and a long-sleeved navy blue t-shirt. She looked down at herself. The knees of the jeans had some dirt on them from the cave. She stood up to wipe it off, gave the shirt a tug to smooth it out, then sat back on the wall to watch for Miss Valentine's return. The view from the patio looked out onto the seaway, the channel between the islands and Clayton's shores. It was here, Violet had told Rue, that the nurses had once wheeled the hospital's children to sit and watch the ships pass by while they breathed the icy air into their weak lungs. Rue wondered if the girl who owned the box under the floorboards had once sat here too, watching the boats zipping past. Speedboats, fancy wooden boats, small aluminum fishing boats. Every so often a massive freighter would lumber between channel markers like a great rust-streaked whale, making the other boats leap up and slam down in its wake. Finally, Rue spotted the whaler cutting across the waves and heading back to Cough Rock. As it came closer, Rue could see that there was someone in the passenger seat. Her stomach felt an anxious twist as her eyes strained to make out her uncle's form, but the canopy obscured her view. It was only when the whaler was finally moored in the lagoon and the passengers stepped out that Rue saw it was not her uncle at all. It was a woman, thin and gray, and dressed in a girlish bottle green jumper dress. From the back of the boat, she hauled out a large, battered suitcase. Miss Valentine tried to take it from her, but the woman waved her away. Miss Valentine took it anyways, and the two ladies started up the path towards the house. Rue kept so still that Miss Valentine might have walked by her without noticing her, but the old lady saw her. She stopped in her tracks and said something to Miss Valentine, whose head then swiveled toward the patio. "Rue," Miss Valentine called. "Come here, please." Cautiously, Rue hopped off the wall and walked over to them. She didn't like the look of this. Miss Valentine's expression was worrisomely satisfied, and the great-haired woman stared at Rue with far too much interest. "Rue, this is Mrs. Wixton. She's going to be your tutor, and your companion." Mrs. Wixton clasped her hands in front of her dress and nodded to Rue very formally. Her hair was thin and so tightly permed that it looked like she had tiny packing peanuts glued to her scalp. "I don't want her," Rue said. "This is what I was talking about," Miss Valentine said to Mrs. Wixton in a confidential tone. "I don't need a tutor," Rue insisted. "The New York State School Board would beg to differ with you, and the local school is not an option," Miss Valentine retorted. "It's an hour-and-a-half trip each way, and come winter you won't be able to go in any case once the river freezes." "Then let Violet be my tutor," Rue said. "She has enough to do," Miss Valentine replied. "And you're the type who needs someone to keep a sharp eye on you." Rue shot Mrs. Wixton a look of cold resentment. Mrs. Wixton didn't seem to mind. She smiled brightly at Rue. Her lipstick was pale pink, the sort of lipstick that a young girl would wear, but her blue eyes were steady and shrewd. "Oh, I predict that Rue and I will be the best buddies before the week is out," Miss Wixton said confidently. She held Rue's angry gaze, undisturbed by Miss Valentine's impatient shuffling, until Rue finally turned away and looked back out the river. Having Miss Wixton around was very hard on Rue. No one had ever kept such a sharp eye on her before. Mrs. Wixton never left her side. There were hours of lessons every day. Mrs. Wixton had once, many years before, been a middle school teacher, and in her suitcase were stacks of moldy school books that made Rue sneeze when the pages were turned. At first, Rue simply refused to do the lessons, but the old lady was used to dealing with rebellious children. She patiently explained that if Rue continued to disobey her, she'd have to inform Miss Valentine. "And that would be a pity, since I believe I'm what you would call your last hurrah. If I don't work out, they may not be able to keep you. Miss Valentine tells me there's a family back where you came from that will take you in." The threat of being sent back to the Burrows was enough. Rue did Mrs. Wixton's lessons, first furiously, then sullenly. The lessons weren't hard, only long and very dull. At first, Rue sped through them quickly, in the hopes of being set free for the rest of the day. But Mrs. Wixton had been told to keep a sharp eye on Rue, and she did her job diligently. Even when Rue was given a break from work and allowed to go outside, Mrs. Wixton accompanied her, always hovering, following along behind her as Rue ran across the rocks. It was unbearable. Rue could not hide in her little cave and watch for the fading or listen to the earth. Even the black squirrel would not come out again to see her with Miss Wixton there. The nights were no better. The little room next to Rue's had been hastily furnished, and Mrs. Wixton was moved in. There was a narrow bed, a tiny dresser, and that was all. But Miss Wixton scrubbed the room and made it tidy, and it seemed as if she would be perfectly content to stay there forever. The first night of Mrs. Wixton's stay, Rue waited until she was sure the old lady was asleep. Then she tiptoed out of her room and started down the hall to listen for the humming. But as she passed Mrs. Wixton's room, Mrs. Wixton called out, "Rue, dear, where are you going?" And then came the rustle of the old lady easing herself out of bed. As it turned out, Mrs. Wixton slept as lightly as a cat. Eventually, Rue found a way to break up the monotony of the lessons during the day. She discovered that Mrs. Wixton was fascinated with the Fanshawe family. Every now and then she would interrupt her lessons to casually ask Rue a question about them. "Is this the only house they own? Why does your uncle stay all winter?" At first, Rue only shrugged glumly. But soon she realized that Mrs. Wixton would rather hear about the Fanshaws than teach Rue a lesson about geometry. So Rue began to make things up. She told Mrs. Wixton that her uncle had a fear of birds, and in the spring he would have Miss Valentine climb all the trees on the property and smash any bird's eggs with a tiny silver hammer, and that one of her cousins had been born without eyebrows, and many other ridiculous things. Mrs. Wixton listened to it all without question. It seemed that there was nothing she wouldn't believe about the Fanshaws, and she never tired of hearing about them. Sometimes Rue was certain that Mrs. Wixton tailored her lessons to bring up topics of the Fanshaws. Once when they were studying geography, Mrs. Wixton pointedly said that they would focus on Brazil that day, and she turned her fusty old textbook to a section on the Amazon rainforest. The shiny yellow paper held some black and white photos of the jungle. Mrs. Wixton flipped through the pages, then stopped at a photo of a squat, thick-bellied man wearing nothing but a cloth around his waist. In his hand was a limp, lifeless monkey held by the scruff of its neck. "Fascinating place, the Amazon," Miss Wixton said. "But then you must know quite a bit about it." "Why would I?" Rue asked irritably. "Because of her," Miss Wixton said. "Your aunt? Mr. Fanshaw's late wife?" She was baiting Rue, trying yet to get a glean of some information about Uncle Emmett, but this time Rue herself was interested. "I never met her," Rue said. "But you must have heard about her." Miss Wixton pressed. Rue shook her head, hating to admit it, yet hoping that Mrs. Wixton would tell her more. Well, she came from Brazil, apparently. A little village on the edge of the rainforest. Her name was Anna. Your uncle spotted her on one of his trips and was instantly smitten, or so the story goes. Mrs. Wixton was clearly thrilled to be able to offer up information that Rue didn't have. I saw her once in Clayton with Mr. Fanshawe. She was quite striking, with beautiful long black hair. But she had a wild look about her. I felt sorry for her. I actually did. A fish out of water. Though of course your uncle was so kind to her, she added carefully. All that gossip after she passed away made me sick to my stomach. What gossip? Rue asked. Oh, folks around here will say anything, especially if it's about summer people. What did they say? Well, Miss Wixton began, rising off the bed for a moment to adjust her skirt. Some people believe she was murdered. She waited for a beat to see that she had Rue's full interest before she continued. It was because her death was so strangely sudden. She had been perfectly healthy and well, according to the people who had been working in this house. And then, quite out of the blue, she was dead. And to make matters worse, your uncle refused to speak about it. He immediately fired everyone who had been in the house except Miss Valentine. It made people suspicious. Who do they think killed her? Rue asked. Miss Wixton now shifted on the bed, straightening her spine and crossing her legs. Of course it was all malicious nonsense. They didn't think it was my uncle, do they? Rue asked, shocked. Her uncle had seemed cold and hard, but killing his own wife? She couldn't imagine it. How did we get on this topic in the first place? Miss Wixton looked at Rue as if it had been her idea. Okay, hocus pocus. Let's try to focus. She patted the pages of the textbook. As the days wore on, Rue's captivity became harder and harder for her to bear. The bright spring light teased at her through the windows. She ached to be outside. The sun was melting deeper into the ground, waking everything up. The earth would be singing by now, and she was missing it. 100 times a day she felt ready to bolt out of her room, fly down the stairs, and run outside to freedom. But the threat of being sent back to the Burrows kept her rooted. Gradually she began to feel sleepy and slow-witted. Her pencil would droop in her hand while her mind wandered, though when Miss Wixton jolted her with a small shake and asked her what she was daydreaming about, she couldn't remember. She was glad for any time outdoors, even if she was under constant guard by Mrs. Wixton. As soon as she felt the sun on her skin, she awoke. She ran around the island, knowing that Mrs. Wixton could not keep up, yet also knowing that there was nowhere really for her to go. She was desperate for freedom and for solitude, even if it was only for the few minutes when she was on one side of the island and Mrs. Wixton was on the other. It was during one of these runs, when Rue had sprinted to run into the island, leaving Mrs. Wixton far behind, that she saw a familiar jutting rock which hid the little cave. In a flash she ducked inside.